right, welcome Soul Community to part 3 of the Soda Lions Who Gets to Thrive series. And a special welcome to those of you who may be joining for the first time. I want to quickly get to our panelists since I know they're going to be dropping some important gems today. Um, but because we're joined by some new friends, I'd like to take a brief moment to ground us in why we're here today. So it's no secret that at its foundation, our education and youth serving systems are inequitable and racist by design. This is who we are. But this is not who we have to be any longer. We have the knowledge, we have the collective power and the responsibility to make different choices, one of which is policy change. We know that at the broadest level, policy, and that's your federal, state, and local, it establishes the conditions and rules within which education is delivered and where change can occur and scale. The policy choices that we make, particularly at this pivoted point, can either ignore or further exacerbate inequity, or it can be leveraged to create more equitable, identity-affirming, safe environments where all young people, particularly our Black, Indigenous young people of color, can learn and thrive. Leaders from the Soda Alliance, we came together across our fields of research, practice, and policy because we believe that knowledge from the science of learning and development can drive transformative change in education and youth serving systems. And this includes significant knowledge about the impact of racism and white supremacy on thriving. The Soda Alliance is a partnership with allies such as the Bell Network and such as the National Urban League, represented by our moderator today, Hal Smith. And it's through learning and engaging in community with other experts that we can support and empower one another to use what we know from the science as a tool to transform our education systems. So that brings us to today. This webinar series is a call to action. The first webinar of this series, we focused on the scientific base, where we explored scientific evidence that can help empower us to advocate for anti-racist changes to education practice and policy. The second webinar, we explored how racism and other systems of oppression impact education practice. So today's discussion will focus on the fundamental shifts in policy that will be required in order to actively disrupt systems of oppression within education and other youth serving systems. So with that, I'd like to introduce our amazing panel for today. Dr. Jackson, Dr. Janice Jackson, CEO of Chicago Public Schools, soon to be Dr. David Johns, Executive Director of National Black Justice Coalition, and Denise Forte, who's the Senior Vice President for Partnerships and Engagement at the Education Trust. Our discussion will be moderated today by Hal Smith, who's the Senior Vice President of Youth and Development Programs at the National Urban League. So with that, I'll pass it over to you, Hal.
Thanks so much, Sam, and thank everybody for joining, and of course, thank our panelists. As Sam laid out, we have a number of pressing issues in education, in health, and well-being that are impacting our communities. And we wanted to take a moment here to talk about what kinds of policy shifts are going to be necessary, not only to meet the moment, but then to build towards a different kind of education offered to young people, a different set of supports and relationships informed by science that we might create together. And in doing so, that we create a more just, a more equitable, a more excellent, if you will, education for all young people and children. I'll begin, asking the panelists to think not only about this moment, but to go back a bit in history to think about how we got here and then project forward on some thinking that we might consider as we talk through plans for next year, plans for the summer, education practice and policy writ large. So I'll begin with David. And David, through NBJC's Thrive campaign, you work to ensure that young people who are traditionally undersupported have access to the equitable, holistic learning and development opportunities that we want for all young people. Can you share 1 to 2 specific examples of harmful or oppressive or inequitable policies that you are seeing in current education systems, and similarly, really about specific populations of young people, families, and communities: BIPOC, LGBTQIA, young people, homeless, houseless youth, any number of young people who are not particularly well served. Is there a set of policies you would look to that explain how we got here, the moment we're in, and that need to be specifically upended to create a better future and a better present in education settings?
We just gonna come out the gate with that large question. Yes. So first, let me say thank you to you, Hal, for moderating this discussion, to my co-panelists, Dr. Jackson and Denise, for your leadership and work in the community more generally. How I'm going to answer your question, but not in the way in which you framed it.
That's all right.
I don't like having conversations about our babies from a deficit perspective.
Mhm.
And so I'll invert the frame and talk about it from an asset-based perspective. What we know now is that in order for us to create policies where all of our babies, right, the vast majority of students who attend contemporary public schools, who are reflective of the plurality of diversity that exists not only in America, but throughout the world, in order for them to thrive in schools, we have to ensure that, one, policies are radically inclusive. Right now, there are states throughout this country that make it illegal for teachers to even talk about, let alone design curriculum or create classrooms that are supportive of students who are LGBTQIA+. For those who don't know the acronym that I'm going through, you can look up the toolkit that is at nbjc.org. But for students who are from sexual and minority communities, right? And so passing the Equality Act would be a critical first step in ensuring that there are clear and consistent definitions. And that would also provide cover to school districts to be able to decrease the penalties for centering students, again, from radically diverse communities. The second is that too often we silo students in ways that suggest that they are parts of themselves, fit neatly into the categories that policymakers are often comfortable legislating around. And in particular, so much of our work, the Thriving Initiative that you mentioned, is the brainchild of Dr. Kia Darling-Hammond. She's a developmental psychologist, and she understands that in order for students to be able to show up in classrooms and to take the kind of risks that are required for them to demonstrate what they know and have learned, they have to feel safe. They have to feel comfortable. And so we spend a lot of time echoing what I know Brother Sean Gingrich has talked about, and ensuring that the health of our babies is centered. When we think about right now, Black youth, the suicide rate for Black youth, school-age youth, has doubled in the last 2 decades, which is an alarming concern for anyone who's thoughtful or caring about our children, because none of them asked to be born, and one of them deciding to take themselves out is too much. But it's also even more concerning when we consider that for every other group of children based on race or ethnicity, the suicide rate has decreased. And so when we think about the fact that the current pandemic, the COVID crisis in particular, has forced students away from schools or campuses where they might have otherwise felt safe or had access to resources, things like broadband technology or LGBTQIA or homeless student support services, they're now sometimes at homes that are not safe or supportive. And so we're seeing these alarming suicide and mental health trends increase. And so it's important for policies to be inclusive in that regard. The last thing I'll say to this, just to again lay another brick in the foundation, is that they have to be place-based. Our policies are built on AFAM Ed Summit, something that grew out of the White House Initiative for Educational Excellence for African Americans, an initiative established under still my president, Barack Hussein Obama. And these were community-led programs where young people, students, as diverse as they show up in the world, were asked what we as caring and concerned adults need to do in order to ensure that they thrive, that they are learning and developing and growing. And it's important for us to design policy and practice not bound by school walls, but that are embedded in the communities that young people are connected to and otherwise conspire for their success.
Thank you, David. We will turn to many of the things you talked about in your response, but I want to move to Denise. Denise, recently the Ed Trust team explored racial and gender biases embedded within school discipline policies, dress codes, attendance codes, codes of conduct that target the cultural identity of girls of color in particular. What are you noticing about how policymakers understand and approach equity work? and anti-racist work. Those are not necessarily the same. And how could policymakers better understand and avert impacts of racism, bias, and marginalization? And I would say not just avert, but specifically upend, right? That there are things in place that need to be changed, not just actively ended, but actively changed to create something new. So what are you noticing about how policymakers are understanding this current moment and the approach to equity and anti-racist work?
Thank you, Hal, and thanks for facilitating this conversation. It's so important that, particularly at this time, we don't lose touch with what are some very fundamental issues that our students are dealing with every day. And I'm so glad that David and Dr. Jackson are here with me to also share their important thoughts on this work. Look, when it really comes to how policymakers understand and approach equity and anti-racist work, I mean, from what we've seen at the Education Trust, it's really only talked about when it's easy, like when it's the easy thing to do, and then very, very little action follows. I think a lot of our policymakers these days are thinking about things very simplistically because they think it's sort of the easy thing to do. They just want to talk about our students learning empathy or being able to build relationships across race, ethnicity, and culture, all of which are very, very important. But it is not yet common for a lot of those conversations to center the experiences of students of color or lift their voices, or even better yet, take direction from those voices and those students. Because despite their experiences, um, both their experiences and their voices are so paramount to understanding and upending, as you said, the impacts of racism, bias, and marginalization. So our seed report and our discipline guide really sought to center the voices of students of color because we wanted to make sure that not only did they offer their values to the conversation, but ultimately that is where we need to uh, focus and focus practice. And our recommendations are based on both what the research says, but also what we learned when we heard from students and families. We want to make sure that policymakers are listening to those who are most marginalized and impacted and create changes, but with them, with their voices at the table. One of the more recent projects that we're about to dive into is going to look at right now what we're calling distance discipline. This really brought about a lot of concerns for us when we started learning about some of the discipline disparities that are continuing to grow even in remote learning, meaning Black and Brown students being excluded from learning. And new questions and challenges are really gaining some attention around this issue. And also to the extent, again, when we're looking at the systems that are set up by the adults, that a lot of educators and school leaders don't have the skills and training necessary to create some positive online learning experiences that prevent and address discipline issues, such as adapting restorative practices to online settings. Um, we have a couple of examples. A sheriff was called to the house of a 12-year-old whose teacher saw a toy gun in his room. A 9-year-old boy was suspended when a teacher saw a toy gun in his bedroom during distance learning. 9-year-old girl's email was blocked as a disciplinary action. Teenage girl was sent to detention after a judge ruled she had violated her probation by not completing her online schoolwork. Every one of these happened to Black children. And despite these anecdotes, we don't currently have the data to show what is happening with regard to discipline and learning environments in these settings at a larger scale. So we're hoping to take on this project to understand them more. But ultimately, your question about policymakers, um, because they tend to look at it through a simplistic lens, it is really important to break apart some of the work that goes on, some of the systems that are at play here, and help them understand what those systems are so they don't, as David mentioned earlier, think of it from a deficit point of view. Let's look to all of the assets that our children of color, that our low income children and their experiences bring to the table.
Thank you very much, Denise. Dr. Jackson, as a systems leader, are there policy decisions that can be made right now in light of COVID, racial injustice, historic inequity, that will not just mitigate our current crisis, but also disrupt systems of oppression, systems of disadvantage, and perhaps of advantaging people as opposed to other groups of people? Are there things that we can do right now in policy terms that we should be taking up and considering?
Yeah. Well, again, thank you for giving me an opportunity to be on this panel. I'm glad I had my mic on mute because I was amen and everything that David and Denise were saying. But in answering your question, a couple of things I'd like to lift up, because I think that, one, role that I'd like to play in this conversation is just highlighting some of our efforts to do this work, because the work is really, really hard. And the example or the analogy that I like to give folks is, it's almost as if I'm trying to drain Lake Michigan, insert whatever lake or waterway near you, one pitcher at a time. And so when we talk about all the work that we're doing from a policy perspective, it feels heavy and it's hard, but it feels like we're doing so much in racism. Systemic racism is like air, it's everywhere. And so I lift that up because I want to share what we're doing, but I also want to make sure people don't walk away with the impression that we figured it out, because we haven't. I think the only thing we've done is started to do this work and learned a lot of the lessons that have already been lifted up today. But I'll start with this notion around discipline. And I was happy that Denise lifted up the discipline piece in a distance learning environment. And one thing that kind of resonated with me was kind of the intersection between that and the issues we've been addressing here around race and race relations, where many of those infractions were decriminalized, if you will, yet, kids were still getting suspended for minor offenses, et cetera. Now we find ourselves in this distance learning environment where, kids are playing jokes, writing things in the chat, and things that, really disrupt the culture from a racial standpoint are minimized while, police are being called for toy guns in homes. Not here in Chicago, thank God, but you get the drift. If we look at our data, we'll see some of those same troubling trends. And so CPS years ago changed our policy, which I think was the first step. That policy said students couldn't be suspended if they were in third grade or under. It had to be extremely egregious and go through a bunch of steps. That reduced suspension of students that at that level by 99%. I mean, we were literally talking about, a handful of kids. Then we also have been annually revising our student code of conduct. And so things that I'm incredibly proud of is decriminalizing, and I'm using that term because we know about the school to pipeline connection there. Things like, using marijuana and other things that would result in an expulsion for a student, a Black student, and result in maybe some kind of restorative practice for students who are not Black or Latinx. And so when we started changing policy and exposing that data, we saw dramatic decreases. We saw 67% reduction in suspension. We literally, this is not an exaggeration, we literally put our expulsion department out of business. We had so few expulsions for the past few years, less than 10, that department no longer exists. Reduce the number of police calls to schools. However, even as we sit here today, there's still great disparities in those numbers. So when kids are suspended, the same holds true. They are more likely to be Black boys or Latinx boys or Black girls for that matter. Even though we've reduced the calls to police our schools, we still are grappling with the debate around police officers in our schools. And, as a superintendent, I could talk about this from both angles, but the point I'm making is we've made a lot of progress. We're in a different situation, because we can talk about equity, we can talk about systemic racism. But what I would offer to people who are in places where this work is moving is to really think about what's the next level, what comes next. Because what I have found is that when you start the easy stuff, which is when you give more programming or give money or, remove some of those barriers, people allow that. What they don't allow is when their share is taken away. And so when we start thinking about access for special education students into some of our most selective schools, met with a lot of resistance. When we start talking about who gets access to some of the highest and most elite programming, if you come into some of those programs, it doesn't look like the representation here in the district. And so I say all that to say that while we've made a lot of progress, we still have a long way to go. I'm excited that we are able to tackle these problems, but the first step was really to name it and to make investments to address it. And I'll talk a little bit more about that later in the discussion.
Thank you. So to open this up a bit and hopefully encourage some crosstalk and some conversation as opposed to just Q&A, want to open up with a question around science of learning and development, right? And the science of learning and development tells us that academic learning and social emotional development and learning are deeply, deeply integrated. Yet policy and practice debates often describe them as in opposition. You can't do one, you have to do the other. If you focus on social emotional learning, somehow that doesn't include intellectual and academic development. Why do you think that is? What kinds of policy dilemmas are at play? And how is this particularly relevant to anti-racism, equity concerns, this idea that you can't do both? You can't care about people and help with their academic development. You can't support young people in their development across multiple dimensions without somehow diminishing their academic achievement. What do you say to these kinds of posing of problems and framing of the ways forward for us?
I'll just say I think for a lot of systems, it's easier to address them separately. It is much easier to adopt a pull off the shelf, SEL program that addresses student behaviors and mindsets than it is to look at the entirety of the system, existing policies, practices in the schools, and the mindsets of adults. It is hard work. And when you have something that is challenging and difficult, and when we are talking about racism and equity, I think it looms large and it's difficult to comprehend. And there are a lot of pieces that go into thinking about it. But what we do know is, these easier approaches are simply insufficient and harmful in many cases. When you're trying to fix a kid, that can do tremendous harm to our students of color. And too often or not, schools are using programs that actually police students and masquerade. This all masquerades as social and emotional support. So when you do take it off the shelf, when you do look at it separately, it can very easily start to perpetuate the racism and harm that we are trying to work so hard against. Um, you know, and it's not just, again, people in the place in the kid. It is looking at the policies. What does it mean to make sure your curriculum is non-stereotypical, that it's balanced, that it evokes cultural interests? What does it mean to look at your policies around access to advanced coursework or changing codes of conduct so someone doesn't get disciplined for having beautiful nails or having their hair done or what they're wearing? It also requires looking at the bias of the adults that are in the building and around our students on a regular basis. building relationships with community organizations who can holistically support student well-being before, during, and after school. But again, if you can just Google SEL, purchase it on Amazon, and send it out to all your teachers, that's definitely easier, but absolutely risks doing more harm.
Everything that Denise said, this were Instagram, I would double tap it and you would see a little heart under it. And I would add two additional things. One is that I taught kindergarten and third grade, which is weird to a lot of people because the profession of education has been feminized. Most people expect for educators to show up like the more than 90% of the profession that is white and female. And that's especially true when you think about the babies. And often when you think about the combination of learning and development, or what we know to be social emotional learning, there's often a greater focus on that at the earlier stages of a child's development. And so a part of the policy problem is that there are still not significant advancements or investments rather to support advancements through things like the Higher Education Act or other federal, state, or local investments in in-service, pre-service, or ongoing training, such that educators at the elementary, middle, and high school level in particular understand the importance of development and the role that it plays in supporting learning opportunities for young people. One of the things that we spend a lot of time doing at the, again, White House Initiative on Educational Excellence for African Americans is leaning into the learnings from the James Comer model of development for young people, as well as the teachings of Barbara Bowman and Erickson Institute. And we had to orient a presidential advisory commission that was predominantly K-12 teachers and leaders and leaders of higher education institutions, and reminding them that so much of the foundation in supporting learning and development of people of all ages begins with those foundational blocks. And we still have a lot more to do with regard to that. The other thing that I'll say, the second point is, Denise mentioned the role of anti-Blackness. We don't spend enough time talking about the role of race and racism and patriarchy and homophobia and ableism that is responsible for upholding the policies that Dr. Jackson talked about the district working through, or the things that are reflected in the Ed Trust report, or that show up in the data that we have access to about the disproportionately negative experiences that students from racial and sexual minority communities face. And if we for a second just think about the fact that often the rites and rituals that make schools what they are, the tests that educators use to justify decisions that are made by students, and we for a second just simply acknowledge and the reality that they're often designed at the very minimum to affirm the well-being and development, emotional or otherwise, of Black children. They're often designed to do the exact opposite. And so at this particular moment, in this global movement for Black lives, every conversation anchored to honoring our shared humanity, ensuring that people are not just simply not racist, but they are anti-racist, has to be radically inclusive in ways that address this past, which continues to result in the policies that we continue to talk about whenever Black children or students from marginalized communities are the center of discussion.
Yeah, building on that, I think a couple things. Number one, SEL and academics have to be linked. I think when we talk about the aspirations of, that being fully integrated, we really are hoping that educators of all, ethnic backgrounds see the humanity in the children that they're teaching. And it's unfortunate in this country because of racism, it is harder for people to see the humanity in our children and our Black babies. It's just the fact. There's data and, studies that have shown, those negative images start early in their career. So I think that's point number one. I think the other thing that I would just pull out is that when SEL is used inappropriately, it's almost masquerading as some kind of character education program or some way to kind of fix or instill middle-class values, which I have to tell you, I had to look that up as a principal because people were like using that term and I didn't know what that meant. You know what I mean? And so it's that kind of approach and people thinking that they're doing right by children when you see the malpractice around SEL. Conversely, and we didn't talk about this, and I want to put this out there for people to think about. I've also seen people on the other extreme do a lot of damage as well. where it's almost like we're going to love these babies to death and forego academics because their situation is so bad that we're just going to focus on SEL and we're going to focus on loving them and making them feel good because we don't believe they can achieve at the same levels as their peers. And so for me, I think it's a really important synergy that needs to happen in order for this to be done well. And I think people, I think everybody's heart is in the right place. But again, when it isn't implemented properly, it's usually being used as a tool to make kids conform to a set of standards that aren't even authentic to them, or it's used to overcompensate and overcorrect while, forgetting what our primary mission is, which is to educate them so that they can have, a equal footing in this environment.
So I think each of you touched on a different aspect of this and really critical, important pieces of this. But I want to come back to this one part of the conversation. We've talked a little bit about young people and racism and students and racism, but how do you generate a conversation? How do you create space for adults to wrestle with race, for superintendents to be prepared to discuss race, for community stakeholders to be prepared to talk about race? Where's the opportunity for adults to wrestle not only with what they're delivering to students, but what they're delivering to one another, the ways that leadership is undermined because people don't believe you can't be X and Y and Z and be a great leader? How do we have that conversation that ultimately gets to young people, but is about adult relationships, adult framing of issues, of problems, of leadership, of service that are challenged by notions of race and racism, sexism, homophobia, misogyny, that there are a number of conversations that need to be had to move us forward? Where do we find and create spaces for adults to wrestle with these? Because the profession doesn't demand it in terms of preparation in most places. The superintendents that I know have told me they don't teach you this stuff in superintendent school. They don't talk about this even in many principal and teacher programs. So how do we create space for adults to wrestle with the most complicated parts of American history and legacy and present and future without removing ourselves from conversations with young people and families and children, but an adult to adult conversation about what's necessary?
So I'm gonna jump in and say that I think adult-only conversations are dangerous. It is too often the case that adults gather in rooms with other adults and imagine what young people need without ever engaging them in discussions about their realities. And if nothing else, what I have found over the course of my career is that having young people in rooms where they feel supported and then empowered, at a minimum, keeps adults honest. And so I want to be clear in cautioning against adults relying upon adults to solve problems for young people. The second thing I will say is that it is incredibly important for us to acknowledge that the opportunities already exist. Name a community that is not in some way, shape, or form impacted by and responding to a set of global crises that in some way, shape, or form are attached to the conversation around whether or not Black Lives Matter. And if there is not a community or a school that is engaged in that conversation, at any opportunity you have to talk about achievement data, which is the longest way of us tracking the way that race and racism works in schools, right? Like talking about that data and asking simple questions like, why is it since the introduction of this data, Black students have trailed their non-Black white counterparts and the gap is only widened? And it's getting wider at this present moment because there's a technology gap where students don't have access to technology, they don't have access to broadband. And not only ask the questions, but to me, the thing that's missing is then holding people accountable. It is too often the case that we start and stop these conversations when students are wronged or aggrieved, when parents organize and force us to, when there are thoughtful superintendents like Dr. Jackson who compel people to do this very tough work. There are often flashes of engaging in this conversation at work, the thing that for me will shift it is protracted discussion as well as holding people accountable. I responded in the chat that we need to vote more. And when people don't respond in ways that are measurable and meaningful, we need to escort them out of the way. And so again, my three things are: we shouldn't do this by ourselves. We should empower young people to lead in the ways that we expect them to, not only in school, but in life. We should acknowledge that every single day we have an opportunity to have this discussion, whether or not it's acknowledging existing gaps or talking about how they've been exacerbated by things that are going on in the world, including decisions that adults are making or not making. And then the third thing is to hold people accountable for doing the things that we know should be done based on data, qualitative and quantitative, and otherwise responding to the needs of students and communities.
Thanks, David. Dr. Jackson, Denise, anything on this point, or we're starting to get some questions in from—
I was just going to say ditto.
Okay.
I was too. And just I think David raises a really good point about expanding our notion of the important indicators. Children are so much more than one single data point, right? We need to have a robust set of data. And I would argue, in many instances, if you were to ask a student what matters most, we would have some beautiful data points to really reflect on where the system is doing well and where it's not doing well. So I really do appreciate his point around data.
And this is, at the risk of being persnickety, I'm getting excited because this is what my research, some folks know that I'm also a doctoral candidate at Columbia. And when we think about the variables that matter most to educators, the things that exist on national longitudinal data sets, there is no recognition of intersectional anything. Mm-hmm. Literally, educational data sets do not make space for students who have queer identities, who are Black and living with a disability, who are Black and who have a housing insecurity. We, as conscious adults, understand that those things affect what they know, how they show up in school, what it means for them to demonstrate what they otherwise have learned, but we don't make space for it when we're talking about the tools that teachers in schools use. Mm-hmm. And so by sitting in these disconnects, right, we're all conscious enough to know in a staff meeting, at a school board meeting, at a congressional community discussion, we are conscious enough now to know that these disconnects are designed on purpose, right? Like the system works exactly as designed. If we can not only ask better questions and hold people accountable. And again, young people are the best ones to hold people accountable, right? Like, let's not forget that the lesson that our late Congressman John Robert Lewis taught us is that, like, young people are often willing to put themselves on the line to lead in these incredible ways. And so I don't want us to miss this opportunity because some of this stuff is really, really simple.
So on that idea of things we can do and things that are obvious to us that we should be doing, are there any kind of policy levers at the local, state, or federal levels that you will pull today to change our current circumstance and the circumstances for young people, families, students? Is there, without getting into a silver bullet conversation, is there something that you would do today if you had the power to do so?
Yeah, not a silver bullet, because I don't believe in those, but I think in public education, funding, but I will put a finer point on that because money is not always the solution. We've seen, tremendous investments in different things that didn't work out. I think David's point around accountability is critically important. I think schools, especially the schools that are addressing multiple challenges, need additional funding. They are woefully underfunded, but they are also in places where that accountability and that support to ensure that these things are sustainable, it just isn't present. And so I think that that's the biggest piece. And that goes back to voting and all these other things, not to get ultra political, but here in Illinois, there was a referendum around raising taxes in order to support a variety of things, education. And and they could have done a better job explaining exactly where money was going to go so people could see your yes vote means $300 million for CPS over the next 3 years or something like that. But it was amazing to me to see how many people voted against their own interests, because it goes back to something else that we don't talk about, which is America's obsession with millionaires. People, there's a lot trending on this, like people are voting against, their own interests in these imaginary problems that aren't even their real problems, like raising taxes on the rich. That is not a majority of the people. That is not your problem. What is your problem is inadequate schooling, inadequate access to the things that will make your life whole. And so I think the funding conversation is bigger than more money. It is money, accountability, and sustainability. And that, throughout my experience in public education, just hasn't been there. And it's the thing that pushes people out and burns people out when they try to do this work.
Denise, David, anything to add on that?
I'm just an amen again. I think, it's so funny that you say that, Dr. Jackson, because I was in a conversation last week where someone said, well, I vote against my self-interest all the time. And I said, that must be a beautiful luxury to have, because I, as a Black woman, cannot do that. Neither can I do that having 2 Black boys in my life. Just amen. And I think that the conversation around adults and changing those mindsets is really difficult. And it really, in my mind, takes a leader like Dr. Jackson. And I agree, please don't get burned out. Like, stay with us forever, clone yourself, raise another generation of leaders like yourself, so that we can continue to challenge a lot of these status quo. But I do think it is leadership at the district level and the building level, and support for you as leaders who want to go beyond the traditional and take a look at making sure that community and children are engaged. That is a resource that a lot of people don't want to put funds into, right? To actually make it real robust, because sometimes that means, maybe you're going to provide dinner or have a stipend, or, allowing children to sit around a table. Sometimes you want to incent that. There's a lot of both school systems and restrictions that don't allow you to invest in that kind of robust and authentic engagement. So certainly think that, between the leadership and providing the environment to let leaders like yourself focus on elevating youth voice is really important, especially when you have, I can, not being a school leader myself, but knowing the number of decisions that go into your work every day. I think more leaders, if they had the ability to engage in this work and be supported in this work, would probably go right at it and spend the time doing it.
Yeah, I agree. 3 quick policy things. One is exactly where we are, support for school and system leaders, and including professional development around things like anti-racism, what Yolanda Sealy Ruiz, Columbia professor, calls critical humility, and other things that allow teachers to show up in the ways that we're describing. The second, no surprise, one of the first things Denise, as well as Bethany Little, who's working behind the scenes, and I worked on together, was the Improving School Readiness Through Head Start Act of 2007. We have to invest more in high quality early learning opportunities for our babies, so they're not starting elementary school playing catch up. And then the last thing is mental health support. Again, cannot talk enough about the challenges that our babies are facing, not only regarding the toxic and traumatic stress that they inherit as a result of anti-Blackness and racism and all of the other phobias and biases and stigma that show up. But there are other things that are existing now as a result of, again, the decisions that adults are making or are not making, that are making it much more challenging for our babies to get through the day, let alone to demonstrate learning. And so providing comprehensive support through right now both the Departments of Education and Health and Human Service at every level to meet the needs of our babies is incredibly important. The last thing I'll say for anyone that wants help in thinking about hosting forums that center and support young people and leaders, please connect with us around our Thriving Summits to share again the learnings from the White House to date around centering and supporting young people and doing this with us.
Thank you. One last question. Well, two last questions. One are when you think about leaders, system leaders, stakeholders, community leaders, young people, student leaders, what advice would you give them in this current moment, right? After a summer of insurrection, of protests, decades of struggles, centuries, if not of struggles, what advice would you offer to leaders about being steadfast, right? Because there is opposition. This isn't working into an amoeba. There are people actively trying to undo what we would be trying to do. People who would resist that might be overcome by some additional education, training, exposure. But those who, as Denise said, they're not going to vote against their interests. They're going to actively oppose our interests and don't see them as worthwhile. So what advice would you give to leaders at all levels, in all circumstance, about remaining steadfast and strategic in this moment to use the energy to really elicit change and meaningful, substantive change at that?
I think right now is a good reminder to I don't even want to say reset, but recommit to, everything that people committed to in the wake of the murder of George Floyd. I talked to friends in different industries, many in corporate America, who talked about immediately after that, all the statements that were flying around, the donations, et cetera, and how in 6 months things are back to normal. I feel like we're seeing that in education space as well. Like, it's always been more liberal and you would see more of this, but I feel like a lot of the energy that was talked about, people are waiting us out, for lack of a better phrase. And so my message to leaders would be, you have to keep your foot on the gas. We cannot stop, because people are waiting for this moment to end. And we have to make sure that this moment doesn't end, that we come out on the other side of this better than we were before June 2020. And I feel like people are just waiting for this whole thing to be over.
Yeah, I agree. And for that reason, I'm going to remind everyone of the moment that many of us who used to take flying for granted would ignore and rush past, which is that in case of an emergency, you need to take care of yourself first. We are in a state of an emergency. We have been for quite some time. It is all exacerbated by COVID and the rest of these crises. And this is the moment where every single one of you who were here when you could be doing something else, who show up on behalf of our children and our communities, have to take care of yourselves so you can continue to do this work. I would offer up again a way to maybe find some respite and some time for you to do the things that restore yourself, is to enroll our babies in leading in ways that they are naturally inclined to. Asking them how they are already solving these problems, asking them what kind of support we can provide them so that they can make these demands and hold people accountable, is a game changer. We've watched it happen in communities throughout this country. And so I would offer that up. And then the last thing is to lean on the data, right? We know, even based on the posture of the most recent administration, that there are resources and tools for us to lean upon, right? We have critical race theory and frameworks for us to be able to analyze how these things work. We have frameworks that allow us to call out how things are often hidden in data, or the way that we speak in things, are the manipulatives or the jargon that we all employ. Lean on that in this moment to expose the opportunity for us to push past these moments of discomfort to actually get to places where we can shift praxis.
There is nothing like the truth from young people. They are going to lead the way. And I find that it doesn't take much to get them to open up and share and talk about what matters to them, the language that they would prefer to use, the identity that they inhabit, and making sure that we're all using our ears to listen. We love to talk at, and we don't like to listen. And I think these in this time, probably more than ever, we could use a little bit more listening as opposed to talking, to hear and really absorb what is going on in young people's minds in their everyday living. I have a 12-year-old who's remote learning right now and a 8-year-old who's remote learning right now, and they do their best to share with me, but there are times when all they want me to do is just listen. And I would just encourage us all as leaders in education, as stakeholders, to listen to those communities that we know are impacted the most, ask them to participate in the process and in the policy making. We're going to try to do more of this with some of the distance discipline work that we're going to be doing in 2 school districts. We were actually going to have the young people formulate the policy and work with the parents on how to effectuate that policy. So we'll have stuff to share, and I can't wait to share it with you as we learn more ourselves. But thank you so much for this opportunity.
I want to thank everyone for participating. On behalf of the SOLD Alliance, I'd particularly like to thank my dear colleagues and panelists, David, Denise, and Dr. Jackson. Please be sure to join the next Who Gets to Thrive webinar series, part 4. And thank all of you for joining us and for your participation and all of the work that you do.